Yes.
So we've got about half an hour and roughly half an hour for questions, if that's okay.
That's okay. I'll go very fast. And thank you very much for your words of welcome, and thank you all for coming. I know exactly how you feel because I can see the documents in front of you. I, after these 6 years, as head, am now on leave, and I have this wonderful sense of liberation when I see these things. But don't worry, your time will come. You will have that sense one day too, no doubt. Anyway, I've been. My background is as a professor of international relations who was interested in ethics in IR, and then to my amazement, I found myself head of the Department of War Studies, which wasn't what I expected when I started my career. Anyway, it was a very rewarding experience, but this led me to consider this topic. And the more I got into it, the more interesting I find it. So I hope you do too. What got me going was, of course, the deliberations about whether to intervene in Syria. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot in detail about Syria because I don't know much about it. But here was a case of intervention which raised my curiosity. So, the case to be made that I wanted to make is the following. In conventional warfare, the focus has been on the means of warfare. Certainly in my department there's a lot of study of that. And politicians and soldiers focus their attention on how to win wars. Attention is paid to developing better weapons, deploying them more effectively, devising strategies for their use, and so on. At the heart of this kind of activity was the notion of military necessity. For example, consider World War II. The problem was how to defeat the Axis powers and what weapons to develop and how to deploy them best. In these conventional wars, ethical concern played a part in the decision to go to war in the first place, and then to some extent in the means of conducting the war. But nevertheless, I think you would agree that for the most part, once these so-called total wars were underway, the engagement with ethics, either jus in bello or jus ad bellum or jus in bello, was rather minimal because once again military necessity takes over. Now, in this presentation today, I shall make the case that the relationship between ethics and military affairs has changed in ways that are fundamental, and it seems to me really misunderstood. These changes are what I want to talk about today. And my claim is that if we fail to understand the role of ethics in these new wars, we're likely to make bad decisions and there will be bad outcomes all around. And I think one could run the Syria case through your mind as I'm talking. So, to summarize this next page very quickly, in international relations, even now, after all the years of critical theory and post-structuralist theory and so on, nevertheless, the discipline as a whole, especially in the United States, is preoccupied with the notion of power. That IR is basically a study of how power is developed and wielded in international relations. And even if you get to the critical theorists, they're then interested in the power that lurks in the languages we use, or how the language we use is also an exercise in power. So the focus is always on power, it seems to me. Things have improved slightly, is that textbooks these days will have some chapter towards the end, you know, chapter 13, 14, that has something about human rights, something about ethics in IR, and then the very last chapter is about feminist approaches to IR. But nevertheless, things are improving somewhat in that most departments of IR and most places that teach IR now have some ethical modules tucked in there somewhere, but it's still not at the center of things. And I want to make a claim in this paper today that it should be much, much closer to the center than it has been up to now. Now, there's a puzzle that I want to keep at the heart of my talk today, and the puzzle is this one, is that these modern wars, or what I call asymmetric warfares, which include, of course, the global war on terror, have this feature, is that they're asymmetric in that the war is conducted between a great power and quite often a superpower on the one hand, and then on the other hand a teeny-weeny little group, like, for example, Al-Nusra or Al-Qaeda, and there are umpteen of these teeny-weeny little groups. And I mean they're teeny. When asked, you have a centre here at Monash, and we have one at King's that study terrorism, and you ask about how many activists are there, and you will always hear, well, there are probably 1,000 or less than 1,000. So the question is, how do these wars work, where there's this huge discrepancy of power when measured by any of the normal standards like economic might, number of troops, level of technology in your weaponry, and so on? How come you can have a war, first of all, between such unequal people, such unequal entities, and more puzzling still is the little guys do manage to exercise power. You know, power is getting some actor to behave as it would not have behaved but for the exercise of power. And in the case of Afghanistan and Iraq, we see the little guy has moved the superpower and its allies to change its plans, and most dramatically they've decided to cut their losses and run. So how does the little guy exercise power over this enormous military muscle of a superpower and its allies? I'll get to what I think is the answer later on, but I need to do some preliminary work about ethics in IR. So international relations is a realm, as we know, of human action. And in the contemporary world, the most important actors in this domain are states. Now, all of us, as citizens of state, participate in one way or another in interstate activity. Our states participate in international organizations, they make treaties, they fashion international law, and so on. And most dramatically, from time to time, we get wars. But we don't only participate in international relations as citizens of states like this one, Australia, but we also participate in international relations as rights holders in what I call global civil society. Most people, in most cases, consider that they have human rights. They participate in what you might call the discourse of human rights. It's not the case that their rights are heavily defended or equally defended in every place, but everybody participates in this practice. So we've got at least these two global practices in which people participate. Now, in both the Society of Sovereign States and global civil society, we interact with one another through an ongoing series of actions. These are only available to us as participants in these practices that I've mentioned. The practices seen as social wholes consist of a set of social rules which determine who are the legitimate participants, you know, what is it to be a citizen, what menu of appropriate actions do you have as a citizen or as a civilian in civil society, what sanctions are called for in response to misconduct by people, and what would count as grounds for expulsion from those practices. So participants, that is you and me, not only know the rudiments of what is required in these practices, but we also know what the ethical commitments are that are embedded in those practices. So I think I can generalize the point not only about those two practices, but about all practices whatsoever, like this one here this morning, this seminar. All practices have their rules, which I've mentioned. Who participates, what may you do, what are you not allowed to do, and what would cause you to be expelled. But all participants in practices like this one, we also know the embedded ethic in the practice. So this one this morning, I presume we're all committed to the advancement of knowledge, the testing of theories, we're committed to having an academic dialogue and a number of other things. Now, so To participate in a practice, to do things in a practice, is to know the rules and to have some knowledge of this ethics, of the ethics that is built into it. Now, what are the ethics embedded in these two practices that I've mentioned? Now, I've written an enormous amount about that, and I'm going to condense it into a few bold statements because the time is ticking and we want to have a discussion at the end. But both practices are anarchical practices. There's no central government. They're just a set of participants. And both practices, I think, have embedded in them two similar sets of values. In the practice of sovereign states, in which we're all participants, the core value is the freedom of each state to conduct its internal and its foreign affairs as it sees fit, subject only to the constraint that it recognizes the right of other states to do the same. In civil society, each of us as a rights holder, a little sovereign if you like, is entitled within a domain to exercise our rights as we see fit, pursuing very different objectives, subject only to the constraint that the other, that we recognize a similar right in others. The second value in both practices is that it seems to me logical that we value diversity. Why else would we organize things in this way? So, as rights holders in civil society, we value that it makes possible for each person to go different ways. So it creates a society which accommodates diversity, and the society of sovereign states also accommodates diversity. Now, you can see, and I needn't talk much about that, that if I wanted to present this ethical theory properly, it would have to take a lot longer than I've done it now, but I'm not going to go on. I've said enough to allow me to get to the central part of this paper about warfare. In all social practices, including the Society of Sovereign States and global civil society, the counterside of good conduct by participants is bad conduct. That is, the commission of a foul, or a plural, fouls. Let's first of all consider the Society of States. The participants in this practice understand that amongst other actions, aggression against another state directed towards conquest, colonization, accumulation of territory, and so on, is a wrong. That's an ethical foul. All states know that. The ones we consider good states or bad states, they all know that that's a foul. To commit aggression against another state is then to commit a wrong. And it's the same as in other practices like this one here this morning. If you commit a foul, consequences follow. So if it turned out that this whole paper of mine was plagiarized, the other participants in the practice would very soon excommunicate me from the practice of academics. Similarly, states that commit fouls bring upon themselves drastic results, as did Kuwait in the first Kuwaiti War. In like manner, participants in civil society, international civil society, know what is required of them, and they know what counts as fouls. Thus, when participants are guilty of abusing the rights of civilians through, for example, theft or fraud, the wrongdoers will find themselves on the receiving end of criticism, opprobrium, and punishment, and all sorts of other consequences. So, what I then have given a very brief outline is what I understand to be practice theory. The core aspect of practice theory is you're constituted as a kind of actor within the practice, with all the rules I've mentioned. You understand the ethics in the practice. You understand what doing right is, but you also understand what committing a foul is. This brings me to the heart of the matter now. If we look closely at what I have set out, we shall see how participants in social practices are always vulnerable to ethical criticisms, which, if successful, can directly affect their power, prestige, and at the limit their very standing as participants in those practices. Let me set this out in a little more detail. It is probably easiest to do this by considering an example Well, I've already done that from the academic sphere. So if you find me guilty of plagiarism, I served in a department once. I arrived as the new head of department. In the first week I was there, an MA student walked in and said, that professor, who was the other professor in the department, the only other professor, is guilty of plagiarism. It turned out to be true after a long thing. And that was effectively the end of that professor as an actor in academic life. So just as academics are vulnerable to these kinds of criticism, so too are participants in the global practices. And we saw that in Kuwait. So how does this all affect warfare? And I think we now are sort of getting close towards the nub of the matter. Let's get back to the puzzle concerning the power of small groups in wars against massive superpowers and their great power allies. As I mentioned in what has come to be known as the global war on terror, small groups, the so-called terrorists, in particular Al-Qaeda and other groups in Afghanistan such as the Taliban, exert extraordinary amounts of influence and power over the world's only superpower. How is it possible that this happens? Now let me dismiss one answer to this question straight away, which I think is just absolutely facile. The one answer is to say that the power of these groups derives from the terror that they sow. Now that is blatantly wrong. We know, for example, that after 9/11 it caused a lot of consternation and so on, but to say that the whole of the United States was terrorized into shivering in action was just wrong. It had the exact opposite effect. They were terrorized or galvanized into some rather drastic action. So to say that the terrorists derive power from terror seems to me not. Now a better explanation, and this is the one I want to push of course, is that power has been leveraged, or as the English say, leveraged by these small actors in the following way. The terrorist group, Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, commit a number of significant ethical fouls. They're really dramatic fouls. You can't do this maneuver unless it's a really bad foul. Thus, for example, AQ flew the hijacked aeroplanes into the Twin Towers. It committed a series of bombings in London and Madrid. In Afghanistan, they do these IEDs and so on. People use human bombs throughout the world in various places and so on. Now, these are ethical fouls. All the participants in the global practices I've described, including you and me, they know these are ethical fouls. They're outrageous. Now, these deeds alone did not cause significant damage to the superpower and its allies. A few small deaths, or some hundreds of deaths at most, nor did they succeed in spreading widespread terror. Instead, by these acts, AQ bounced the superpower and its allies into a righteous response, which response overstepped the bounds of the ethical constraints implicit in the practice. In other words, they commit a foul to bounce the other actor into worse fouls. And that reaction then turned into an overreaction in which they undercut some of the ethical constraints normally operative on participants in the practice of states. In other words, these minnows provoked the Goliath into committing a series of ethical fouls which undermined the Goliath's own ethical standing, prestige, and thereby their influence and power in international relations, and won for the minnows some kind of legitimacy which they would not normally have got. For example, the initial bombings of the Twin Towers led to, now I'm talking about the fouls that the bombings led to the following fouls. For example, it led to the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, which could be construed as occupations, plausibly construed as occupations, though that is an ethical foul. It led to the introduction of a new class of, what did they call it, severe interrogation, which looks like torture to the rest of us. That is an ethical foul. It led to the introduction of a new category of prisoner, hitherto unknown, called the unlawful combatant, who is not a prisoner of war and is not a criminal. That itself is an ethical foul. It introduced a new procedure for transporting of these people from one place to another called special rendition, which by most measures is some kind of ethical foul. It introduced a set of activities which looks to the rest of us like assassination, and these assassinations quite often take place by means of unmanned aerial vehicles, and so on. There's a long list. It led to the creation of prisons in strange hidden places, the dark places, which also look like ethical fouls when measured against the implicit values in global civil society and the society of states. So within the wider international community then, many of these actions were interpreted as gross affronts to core ethical values embedded in both the society of states and global civil society. These ethical criticisms have had massive international effects. One effect was to inspire many young people from a wide range of differing countries to consider supporting AQ. Perfectly reasonable bourgeois kids in the United Kingdom suddenly found themselves trekking across the world to go and fight in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, and so on. Another was to give many citizens within the USA and its allied states good reason to oppose the governments of the day. So we found Tony Blair was soon history, and the Bush regime disappeared as a result of reactions partially morally driven by the voters in those states. A consequence arising from these ethical criticisms was to deal a substantial blow to the ethical standing of the superpower and its allies. This in turn affected the political power of these actors on the international stage. And the result was, in the immediate election after Obama's election, was a shift in policies, or at least it appeared to be a shift in the first phase. So let me repeat the rudiments of the technique that has been used so successfully here. This is at the heart of this kind of war. In this kind of war, what you have to do is you have to commit an ethical foul in order to prompt a worse one, which will then start gaining you legitimacy and power. It's a weird, backhanded kind of process, but I think that's at the heart of the maneuver. The maneuver outlined is analogous. Now, you must understand I'm a South African, so just forgive this little bit. Is analogous to that quite often takes place in certain kinds of games like soccer, but especially rugby and water polo. Here, considerable advantage can often be gained by flouting the rules in order to provoke a foul by the opponent. Down there in the scrum where things are down and dirty, you start muttering racist insults and homophobic stuff, and somebody stands up and clobbers you one, and you get a penalty and you win the game. See? It's that sort of thing. But you can only play that maneuver in a practice which has the ethical architecture that I've described. The foul to commit a foul requires the players, even the dirty guys, understanding what the actual values really are. Now, it may be said, and I often meet this criticism, that all this ethical talk is only whitewash to uncover stuff that is done for power, political reasons. But you can't make sense of what I've made, of the argument I've made, unless most of the players, most of the time, stick to the values that really are inherent in these practices. How am I doing for time, somebody?
About
5 more minutes? Yeah, because that's the central argument. That's the one we can actually have a chat about. But there's some really delicious consequences that I want to point out now. I really like the next bit best. There's a little heading here that says the hidden hand in global politics. Now, it may well be that AQ and similar movements did not originally, with deliberate intent, set out to deploy the technique I've outlined. I'm absolutely certain they didn't do it with anything, they didn't do this intentionally. Their immediate motivation for their conduct was no doubt inspired by fundamental religious beliefs, some God was on their side. However, it is not these beliefs that account for the power that has accrued to them. Their success is more plausibly attributable to the way in which they ethically wrong-footed their opponents into doing unethical things which lost the opponent's power. So the subsequent conduct of AQ testifies to it having clicked, cottoned on to the success of its technique. So immediately after the Twin Towers, we used to see lots of beheadings and public torturings and so on. But as soon as they clicked on to the power that they gained from provoking the US into doing these things, they themselves had to clean up their own act if they wanted to continue collecting legitimacy. So once you start doing this foul, to commit a foul technique, you yourself have to start adhering to the core norms of the practices in which you claim the technique. So the bad guys are going to start cleaning up their act. And yeah, you can see how that might go. Another consequence, which I hope is true, this is more of a hope than a certainty, is there are a lot of social scientists just like you and me, and I think these guys are really guilty of ethical fouls, who use the argument about the case of the exception. You know, so you heard that after the attack on the Twin Towers, the United States and a lot of academics in support of it said, normal ethical constraints are now out of the window because we are faced with an existential crisis. It's gone. Now, what I think subsequent things have shown is that argument won't wash, because the minute you say this is exceptional, anything goes, you then open yourself up to all the ethical criticism from all the other participants in these global practices, and you're going to lose ethical standing. Use the argument from the exception and you're done for. But nevertheless, there are a lot of my post-structuralist colleagues who still go on ranting about the argument from the exception. And of course that gives a lot of support to certain countries that themselves use the argument a lot, most notably Israel. Just quickly, my last comment then, about ethical education. In traditional understandings of ethics and IR, the story goes like this. IR is essentially about simply a power struggles between various actors. Ethics at the very best is on the margin, a slight constraint. So the idea is that those who talk about ethics and IR are really like missionaries trying to convert wrongdoers into just trying a little harder to be good. That's the story. On the analysis I've given, the story is completely different to that. It couldn't be more different, because the analysis I've given is to be an actor in these practices requires of you that you understand the ethics and that you obey it. And I come back to the example of those academics like us. To be an academic doesn't require us to be nice and ethical on the margins with regard to adhering to the non-plagiarism law, rule, value. It's definitive of what being an academic is. If we transgress that, we're done for. Now, I want to say that these values, the values of freedom and protection of diversity and so on, are core to the two global practices. And so ethical education is not about urging people to be a little better. Ethical education is about teaching actors what the core commitments really are of the practices in which they're participating. In other words, it's making explicit what sometimes is implicit.
Thank you for keeping such good time with such vast material. It's impressive as the content itself.
Bit of a gallop.
Okay, so I'll just open it up to questions. Irfan.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I really liked it. I just want to make a complimentary comment about this relationship between ethics and IR. I'm an anthropologist, and when I started reading IR literature, from this perspective, from the issue of ethics, it was very surprising how this issue was absent.
Yes.
And in those terms, it was very boring for me as an anthropologist. So this is just a complimentary comment on that. But in 1946, William Foote White, he wrote an article in American Political Science Review saying that ethics should be left to the philosophers, and anthropologists and political scientists should study political behavior. So at least in that tradition, it is very clear that ethics is not part of political science and so on and so forth. But coming to your main argument, I agree with it, but I want to push it in a different direction. To say that the violence by terrorists is an example of ethical foul, right? The opposite of foul is what? Fair.
Right? Yes.
So my English is bad. But there are other readings of that, and these terrorists can be read as Thoreau's and Gandhi's of 21st century. Henry Thoreau
yes.
and Gandhi's, because the basic question is that Gandhi was not against violence as it is understood. He was against the externalization of violence. So you had the revolutionary terrorists in the 20th century. Gandhi was very appreciative of these terrorists. His only problem was he advised the terrorists that you don't externalize the violence, you internalize it. And therefore, this idea of fast unto death. So I don't kill others, I kill myself, right? Now, there is one reading, and I'm relying mainly on, I'm not sure if you have engaged with Faisal Devji's book, which is called The Terrorist in Search of Humanity. So the argument here is that these acts of suicide bombings or violence are actually profound expression of ethics, because for Thoreau as well as for Gandhi, if there is a disjunction between what you think is morally and ethically correct and the practices of the state, Thoreau would say that, resistance. So you are not morally bound to obey the command of the state or the regime. So in that sense, it is not an ethical foul, but on the contrary, it is expression of ethics in a perverse way. So there is number one point, and much like that, I suppose it is also, there is a universalizing tendency. So after Madrid bombing, if you look at the statement of Osama bin Laden, and that would be my second question to you from anthropological perspective, when you base this argument, have you looked at the views or the statement of the terrorists themselves, or these are as reported, in Sun or Guardian or whatever, New York Times? The statement was, he said that security is not only for few in the West. Either it should be available to all or none. So it is a universalizing claim that we should be also included in the debate about security. It should not be just limited to one.
If I can give quick answers to both of those questions at once, really. Suppose we regard some of these terrorist groups as putting forward, well, they're not non-violent like Gandhi was, but putting forward an alternative point of view, an alternative ethics to the dominant Western one, and so on. Then you've simply got, this group versus that group, and you would then have to start looking at the power of each group as calculated in the normal way. So you'd have to think, well, how many supporters have the terrorists? The terrorists might be articulating an alternative vision, an alternative ethic, and you'd say, well, yes, they're doing that, and that's certainly true. But my question is, where is their power coming from? Because they do not have tens of thousands or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of supporters. By whichever measure you take it, they've got very small groups of support. And you cannot explain the power that they in fact wield by reference to the small group or by reference to the strength of the arguments they're offering. So the argument I'm presenting here is these groups have inadvertently discovered the power they can wield by operating within the practice as it's presently constituted. I have no doubt that some of them believe exactly what you've said. You've given an accurate account of what they believe. But if it was simply an encounter between a small group with beliefs that are at odds with the majority of states, then you'd simply have a minority versus the majority, no power being exercised. Whereas what I'm seeking to answer here is, how come the small group actually in the end turns out to be able to wield power, to get a superpower to change its trajectory, to get the United Kingdom to decide that they're leaving now. Or I saw, since I've been in Australia's decided to leave right away. That's an exercise in power, yeah.
Paddy.
I just have a very broad question about the relationship between ethics and power and ethics. And I know a journalist said that actually the world changed not on September 11th, but on September 12th, when
yes.
there was
The response.
Yes. Now, the United States and the United Kingdom, which I'm from too, had the power to decide where they were going to go. So, in a way, I'm just wondering if ethics can be created out of power as well as responded to through power. Does that make sense?
Well, I think of what I'm saying, but I mean, you've got to the heart of the matter, which is, what is the relationship between ethics and power? And I take myself to be articulating this kind of relationship, is that power always results from actions of certain people. Whatever understanding of power you've got, it will always involve this group doing things and getting some other group to do what they wouldn't have otherwise done. And it's the analysis of action and situating actions within practices with embedded ethics that gives point and purpose to the kind of explanation I've given here. So my thought is that all actors, to act and to do things, is to be participating in some set of ethical arrangements. And your actions are related to ethics, I think, in the way that I have said. At the point of decision, where the and there was a point of decision, I mean, I remember it very, very well. In the immediate aftermath of the 9/11, there was a moment in which even the Bush regime was talking about criminals. This is a international criminal act. And then after a number of hours, I think it was 48 hours, can't remember exactly, suddenly they took a decision to start using the language of warfare. So they could have gone one way and they went a different way. But whichever choice you make, you're still operating in the practice in which you've been constituted. And it will still drag in its what you do will be read against the ethics embedded in the practice that you're doing it in.
So if I could just come in on this point. So what is it then that makes this about ethics rather than just the strategic manipulation of them? Because it seems that you can do everything you can.
What makes ethics so... Well, I need to give you a definition of ethics in the first place, and I think it goes something like this. And it's just useful to talk about small groups that we're actually participating in right now. So here we are participating in a seminar which is undergirded by commitments to the advancement of knowledge and so on. Now, when I say that value, the advancement of knowledge, is the core ethical value, what makes it ethical? Why? Now, my understanding of ethics is, ethics, we know we've hit the ethical bit when we would say that infringing that norm is so fundamental that if you do that, you're cutting yourself out of the practice. In other words, infringe that norm, you're no longer an academic. So ethics are values that operate at that level, bedrock level. And all practices whatsoever have got an ethical component to them. They've got values embedded in them such that if participants flout them, they're out.
But you're talking about rules and law also here.
Yeah.
Okay, can I maybe, I think I appreciate
Yes.
the two senses of ethics, and I think
Yes.
there's quite those philosophers in the room,
Yes.
the sense of, and Brooke Atkins and I talk about a feminist research ethic, a way of doing research, which
Yes.
is not the same as the ethics of research and the ethical standards that you would need
That
to
you
build
apply,
institutional
yes.
ethical boards, for example.
Yes.
So I actually like what you're doing there, and I think that the first sense of ethic we might say is akin to what constructivists in international relations might speak about as constitutive norms that are constitutive of the
Yes.
state system or of international relations. But what I was surprised with in the way that when you talk about the ethic that's embedded in the practice of international relations is you talk about those two values, freedom and diversity, and rather than sovereignty. Because I think sovereignty is very different from either freedom or diversity. And if we read the ethic of international relations is sovereignty, and I know many of our colleagues talk about the changing of sovereignty and how sovereignty itself is being reconstituted. But if we understand that, giving basically a license to the state to have a monopoly on power, on coercion and violence, and having to fulfil certain constitutive norms about what constitutes a sovereign state, and Ben's work really speaks to Ben's work on Kurdistan and other. It really speaks to what those constitutive norms are and how they're being transgressed in the contemporary period. Then I don't think that Al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups are actually what they're doing is forcing the US and other actors to kind of to contravene that ethic. I think that with the United States we can say, with a history of American exceptionalism, that what you're talking about when you talk about freedom and diversity is about an international society of states. And the United States may have never subscribed to some of those norms that relate to freedom and diversity ever. And so that there's much evidence from American foreign policy of contravening basic norms of freedom and diversity. And so that what's happening then is that the terrorists are making it obvious, that they're making visible the contradictions in American sovereignty and American foreign policy. They are showing that America is not actually a member of international society. And I think that's very powerful, but I think that for me that's slightly different. That they're showing that there's a facade, that Western sovereignty is a facade, and targeting the twin towers, the kind of pillars of capitalism and democracy, is about revealing that as a facade. So I guess I would like a response to that. Where is sovereignty in the equation, and how can you really equate that with freedom and democracy? And I guess secondly, then if you want to make this argument, I think from an empirical, not a normative perspective, you would actually need to show that there's some self-understanding of Al-Qaeda or terrorists of mutually recognising this ethic, or what I might call constitutive norms, and to be able to so show evidence they know the rules, and to trace the processes whereby they so-called clean up their act or come closer to adhering to those so-called norms.
Two very nice questions, and in particular the first one. So the theory that I've developed over my career, the title I give to it is constitutive theory. So my second book was called International Ethics of Constitutive Theory. So I understand that all social practices are things within which actors constitute one another in terms of certain constitutive rules. So you can ask the constitutive question about every practice. Your question is about sovereignty, and I have interpreted sovereignty as a claim to freedom. That's what's when a state says, take the African states of the African Union at the moment. They are very het up about this notion of sovereignty, and they're really very skeptical about R2P, for example, because they say we're sovereign states. Now, what's going on there? They want to demand that internally each state has a right to develop its domestic policies as it sees fit. You see, that's a claim for a certain kind of freedom. Whereas the R2P people are calling on civil society norms, saying states are only going to be accorded sovereignty if they look after the rights of their citizens inside. But what really intrigued me about your question, and this is the one I want to come back to vigorously, is your notion that maybe the United States has never been a member of the Society of States. And that's the bit, you see, what you're pointing to then is what I'd say a kind of methodological individualist approach where the individual is the state. So just the language you use suggests that you can contemplate a world in which there are states, some of which belong to a society of states, and one or more don't. Now that's incoherent as far as I'm concerned. Why? Because there's a practice of states, and the United States is a core member of the practice of states. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that how do you know when a practice exists? Answer is when participants criticize one another and accept criticisms for making mistakes. So in a practice like this one of academics, we know exactly what's called for. You've all got your essays to mark over the weekend, and we all know what would count as a mistake if we found that some of you were granting a mark by throwing some dice, giving the mark according to a throw of the dice. That would be counted as a mistake. Similarly, between states, if you tamper with the sovereignty of the United States, you get criticized, and the US reaction towards the Twin Tower attack was exactly that. We have a right that you not attack our towers. Why? Because we're a sovereign state. So I want to, if we had a lot of time, we would have a big argument about which of the two statements is true. In the beginning, there was individual states who then may or may not have formed a society. That's the English school approach. I want to say the language I hear suggests that there already exists a practice of states. And then your second question, how do I know Al-Qaeda has cottoned on to the rules of the game? And the evidence would be that when you look at the public broadcasts on the web and so on, they start using the language. They're torturing our people. These are occupiers. Well, what does occupier mean? What do they mean when they say they're occupying? They say they're occupying what? The country called Afghanistan, with the borders that are recognized in the practice of states. They're not claiming occupier of something else. It's occupier of that state, and then in Iran we get a similar answer. And in Pakistan, when the drones attacked Pakistan, the Pakistani government said, oh, whoa, you are infringing our sovereignty by assuming you can engage in a kind of international policing operation from the air. So that's how you look at the language that AQ uses when they criticize the infidel. They use language that we understand pretty well.
I agree with you on that.
Yes,
but
yes.
I think that I would need to see that laid out.
Laid out in more detail.
Empirically.
Yes, no, that's a good question.
Guys, just Paul, sorry, go ahead.
Thanks, Mervyn. That's fantastic. I really love the setup. The practice-based conception of ethics is really good. I want to ask you, though, about this question of the exercise of power by terrorist groups, which, if I understand you correctly, is measured by the loss of the ethical standing of their opponent. Would that be correct?
Yeah, and the loss of legitimacy.
Okay, so in that case, for the terrorist group to be effective, it has to reinforce the ethical standards.
Yes.
Okay, so one of the
That's a self-cleaning process.
Okay.
It's like criminals, you know, like the mafia. All mafia, so you make your money by doing bad things,
Yeah.
but you want your kids to go to nice schools, and then you don't want them to be crooks.
It becomes quite a perverse consequence.
It is.
I guess. So the terrorist groups are then more invested in the ethical standards than perhaps the superpower is.
Yes.
And those ethical standards have to be maintained in order for the terrorist groups to be effective.
Yes. It is perverse.
So I'm just wondering, in what sense was this an exercise of power, where the terrorist group is reinforcing the dominant ethical code of the society of states?
Oh, I'm interested in analyzing. Okay, so we've got the society of states in which states can use their freedoms, and it's an anarchical order. Now, in anarchical orders, some win and some lose. So, if you take a component of global civil society is the global market. In the global market, without any wrongdoing, we exercise our rights, and before we can blink, we find there's Microsoft that dominates the whole world, or there's some other company that's done. So you get these differentials of power growing within the practice. So I'm talking about power within the practice. Getting this actor to shift, do that. What are you unhappy about?
It just seems to me that is the objective of the terrorist organisation in this case to reinforce the ethical standards that are embedded in the practice of the society of states. Is that really what their objective is? Because that's all they seem to do, all they seem to achieve.
You see, let's talk about Syria. So I didn't come to the Syria bit because I was running out of time. But the Syria bit goes like this, roughly, quickly. Is that after the chemical weapons attack, the small group, whoever it was, there's some ambiguity about it. I don't think for a moment it was the government itself of Assad. It was some other group. Was desperate to get an overreaction that they had been so successful in getting before. Because had they been able to get the United States and the UK to invade, they would have got exactly what they wanted. They could have then run with anti-Americanism, which is already running high. They would have accumulated yet more power. They would have downsized the status and legitimacy of the United States. And they would have upsized the legitimacy of various groups, including, let us say, the Taliban, who would be agitating for more influence, power, and autonomy in those states. But what they wouldn't have done is destroy the system of states. And that's what you're upset about.
Not upset about it.
But I just still want to come back to your point. What actually have they achieved in terms of changing US practice? Because I would see much greater continuity post 9/11.
All right. I think they've achieved. There's another section I left out because there are all these intriguing sections. There's a section about. I think there's already been a learning process on the side of the great powers. In Afghanistan and Iraq, they just went in, and they fell neat. Ned Lebow and I are now writing an article on ethical traps, and they fell neatly into the ethical trap and lost power, influence, and prestige. So, at the next opportunity, when they might have fallen into a trap, which was Libya, they very carefully didn't fall into the trap. In the Libyan case, they could have gone in very easily. Libya wasn't a great military power. The US NATO could easily have overrun Libya within a day or two with not a huge loss of life. But they didn't do it because they didn't want to get into this ethical trap. What did they do? They put in air cover, or whatever it's called, a no-fly zone. And then they sent in another intriguing development of this is they sent in private military companies and special forces secretly to help the indigenous people, the indigenous anti-Gaddafi groups, topple Gaddafi. So when you say what did they achieve, well, the terrorists haven't achieved much, but there's a learning, there's been an ethical learning process that you don't just invade other people's countries, waving a banner of democracy and human rights, because if you're not careful, you'll end up in one of these ethical traps. And that same lesson, it seems to me, has been learned in Syria. So the ethical trap seems to me, for the time being, NATO and the US have learned a lesson, which will then, I would say, shrink the power of the terrorists, of the so-called terrorists.
Okay, I'm just conscious of time, but we do have a few more questions. So
I can see there are lots of questions.
So if people are happy to continue,
There's an ethicist in our midst, and he's got a question.
yeah, I was just going to right next, and then to Jim. Yeah.
So I have a small point and a big point. The small point is that it seems like if you have enough power, at least in some context, you can get away with being unethical. I've been watching Al Jazeera and reporting this vote in the UN that every country is against the U.S. embargo of Cuba.
Of Cuba, yeah.
And apparently it's been like that year after year after year, and nothing changes. So that's the small point. The bigger point is that I'm not sure that you've resolved your puzzle. So your resolution is that the puzzle is, how does the minnow exercise power over Goliath?
Yes.
You said the minnow sort of fouls, and then Goliath commits a bigger foul, and then the minnow gets popular, and there's more minnows, and then there's power for the minnows. But that provides the power too late in the dynamic. The minnow exercised power by getting Goliath to commit the big foul. So the puzzle is, how did the little minnow get big Goliath to overreact in that way? And so I don't think you've explained that. My explanation would be that, Goliath, the explanation is that the big actor has major weaknesses, like an Achilles heel, and the minnow acts on that, and that's how.
What is the weakness?
Self-knowledge.
No, but that's my answer. That's my answer to that question, yes. Is that you're quite right. How does the minnow do that in the first place? My answer is, and I think a lot of the fault lies with IR theorists, is that some of the actors in the practices come to believe false theories about how the practice works. So they believe, for example, in realism. They simply believe the practice is about power. There's no ethics here at all. We're the most powerful state on earth. We can do what we like. Where did they get that? Well, they've been reading Henry Kissinger or something, or John Mearsheimer. So they read John Mearsheimer and they think, all right, it's all about power. We've got a lot of it. Let's zap them. But that's to misunderstand the practice. And if you misunderstand the practice you're in, you're going to come short. So if I bring it back to university life, some students do misunderstand the practice. Some students think it's all about simply getting good marks for your essay. It doesn't matter how you get good marks for your essay. You can pay somebody else to write your essay for you. You get a good mark, you think that's a good result. But you've misunderstood what the value of a university education is. You've got a good mark, but you still haven't realized the value implicit in that practice. In a sense, you're shafting yourself. You're shooting yourself in the foot. So the answer, the core answer to everything then is understand, not know thyself, but know thyself in the context of the practice in which you're a participant.
Is it all of, sorry, just on that, is it all about misunderstanding though? Isn't there a conscious rejection of those ethical norms that has a domestic play to demonstrate resolve? Rather than just going, response to 9/11, it's about power, we'll do this, we'll squash them.
Yes.
It's actively and consciously recognising the norms and then rejecting them to say, you know, this, we're showing our strength and our exceptionality, if that's a word, even in the face of these ethical constructs.
That,
it's more a
you see what, if you asked me to write an essay on what you've just said, my essay would go roughly, it would have to be a long essay, but it would roughly go along these lines, which is, yes, you can do that. In any practice, you can reject that. You can reject the core values. You can say, I understand the values, but I'm rejecting them. But you do that, there are consequences. Because the rest of us, we know what the values are. We will bring criticism to bear. We will sanction you. And we will bring your standing as a proper participant in this down, down, down.
Yeah. I meant that just more as a comment on explaining behaviour rather than looking at outcomes.
No, you're quite right. So the behaviour you've just explained is the behaviour of someone who's misunderstood or has not misunderstood but is deliberately flouting. In any practice, anybody can always do that. In this practice, some of you might just flout the convention that we listen to the chair, you know.
That's actually
I've been very compliant with the putting my hand up at the last minute, and letting other people jump in. But I mean, it's a very attractive argument, but I'm still caught on a couple of points. I mean, one of the things to do with asymmetric power relations, and the other is to do with unintended consequences. Now, the anarchists, as you will know much better than me, but in the 19th century, had this idea of the power of the deed. And the power of the deed was you assassinated or bombed or whatever, precisely to show that you weren't part of the dominant regime and that the dominant regime was not all powerful, so that you demonstrate that there were problems. You couldn't take them on militarily, but you know there was something you could do. The second thing is that your model of the ethic has always come back to, and understandably, where academics would understand the ethic in which we work, if you flout it, there will be consequences. But we all in here share that ethic. Al-Qaeda didn't share the ethic of the Americans or possibly of the community of states. So they weren't saying, let's sort of make these things work for us. They were saying, we will, like the anarchists, demonstrate that these these mega states are not all powerful, that we can hit them where it hurts. And so they do. Now, the consequence may then have been, as you said, hey, we've discovered something else.
Yes.
And we can learn from that. So but what seems to me the problem with that is that, yes, there are those sorts of statements on the web where they use the language of rights and freedom and so on. Meanwhile, in Iraq and other places, the suicide bombings go on, sort of the headings go on. It's not a very convincing picture to me of cleaning up their act. So I wonder if that comes back then to Anne's point. Maybe in the end this is all tactical and strategic rather than, in a sense.
Look, I agree with your proposition that some of the AQ operatives might be analogous to the anarchists. let's just throw the bomb, see what happens. My argument is, of course, there are groups that do that all around the world. There are groups that object to what's going on and they throw bombs of one kind or another. But if you just throw a bomb like that and don't learn from the unintended consequences, you will remain powerless. The anarchists you refer to, their history, you know, their history, people read books about it. When you're at a certain stage as a young man, you're intrigued by the romance of it all. But those anarchists are powerless. If you learn, then it starts working in this way. So my question is, question was, how did something that looked initially like the act of an anarchist, that was simply dreadful, killed 3,000 people, we all were shocked. Is that just going to be the end of it? But it wasn't. It had a lot of consequences, and one of them was that this small little group ended up wielding power. So if you don't learn, you won't get power. If you do learn, you will get power. If you get power, you'll start cleaning up your act. Now, that's the bit I find really intriguing. Sometimes we get desperate about how is anything ever going to improve. And I think an analysis of power like this shows, of course it's going to improve, because people like power, and because they like power, they're going to do what's necessary to get it, and what's necessary to get it is to behave according to the ethics of the practice in which you wish to exercise power.
So do you just reproduce the practice?
That's the only game in town. We
So
only
it's back to the Bourdieu question. How do you get outside
there is no
the
outside.
logic?
Absolutely central to my argument is there is no outside, and I have no time at all for people who argue as if there is an outside. We're all participants in this practice. Not we coerced into being participants. We are constituted as participants. That's who we are. There's no external place.
This isn't my area, I hope I don't commit a series of faux pas here. But I was listening to your discussion, I was actually thinking about Vietnam War, the rise of the Viet Minh. Viet Minh is a classic example of a terrorist group. Literally, they were encouraged by the Americans to be so, to fight the Japanese.
Yes.
The expectation was that they would be able to create a nation state in the aftermath, which they weren't about to do. First they fought the French, and they fought the Americans. Which sort of, I thought your model actually accounts for them quite nicely. It does answer your question about, you know, in the future what will happen, because presumably the people who run Vietnam now are the inheritors of the political legacy of Ho Chi Minh. You see them create a state, which then leads me to this observation that when we were talking, I was jotting down notes, and I thought of the Viet Minh and I thought of Al-Qaeda, and I thought the point of difference is that the Viet Minh had an idea that they wanted to create a state.
Yes.
They wanted to be part of the
Yes.
community of states.
Yes.
And I was writing here, what does Al-Qaeda want? When you go back to your sporting metaphor, what's the end game? When we play sport, there's an end game. We know what we're trying to achieve, and we might be hitting people behind play. That's because we want to win something. I've always found this a puzzling thing when people try to account for Al-Qaeda. I think you were sort of kind of answered at some point when you said that there's moves afoot for self-determination in places like Afghanistan or what have you. But I do think that's an important point of difference. That there's a sense that Al-Qaeda doesn't really have anything beyond other than they're angry with the West or they're angry with the US, but they're not trying to call on the creation of a territory. And that's an important point of difference, say with the Viet Minh, you had a clear idea what they wanted to do and succeeded.
Your point is absolutely well taken, and I simply agree with it, because Al-Qaeda, insofar as it's got a plan, talks vaguely of a caliphate. And what a caliphate is completely obscure. It's not like, you know, the Marxists had a plan for an alternative world, and it was a detailed plan. It was going to work like this and this and this. It would be a communist order. Now the caliphate is just a nebulous idea. So I talk of the self-cleaning operation, but the point you've raised, in a sense, knocks the stuffing out of my argument, because it's not.
I wasn't supported. I'm sorry.
No, I know, no, but I agree with that. Either Al-Qaeda is going to modify itself and become a part of what might be the Arab Spring or not a kind of Islamicist state-based spring in which they want Islamic independent states that are not under the control of the West or something like that. But for the moment, the plan is opaque. I agree, a very nice point.
Patty, you had another question?
Just a very quick one. You used the analogy of the mafia at one point.
Yeah.
And I know Skidelsky, I think it was Skidelsky, he stated that, or one of his colleagues, that the mafia, that the whole notion of the mafia, when they're legitimised, is that actually they can only do business within the rules. That at that point when they're legitimised, it's advantageous to them. But what happened, and what's happening in certain places, is that in legitimising, what they have discovered is that the business ethics that the West, etc., held up were in fact a chimera. Because if you work within business, ethics are the last thing you want. But actually they become a restraint on others rather than on what and who you are. So I'm just wondering whether this whole notion of ethics, I mean, is it universalist, or is it kind of constructed and then manipulated? And it still gets back to this power question.
Let me just answer you quickly to say that in most practices, most of the time, the ethics are conflicted. You know, it's not as if there's a nice little. I've spoken as if there's a nice stable code of ethics that's just there. Well, no, it's not, because things change all the time. There are technological changes. The group you're in encounters other practices that force changes upon it and so on. So we're endlessly grappling with questions about how to modify the ethics of the practices we're in. So, for example, genetic engineering has thrown a lot of our previous certainties about things into confusion. So your point about business struggling with the ethics and so on is absolutely correct. But what I wouldn't accept is that you can have a practice without an ethics. The business wouldn't work if nobody had any, if there was nowhere in that practice some agreement on basic ethics. So the basic ethic of business, of course, is property relations. Is I own this stuff, you own your stuff, and we want to do a deal. So we've got to agree on contract, and we've got to agree on property, and those are ethical categories. You undercut that. If I learn that you don't have respect for property, very, very soon I won't do any business with you at all. Lola has a question.
We have a question from Lola, who I failed to introduce before, who's the host partner.
I'm just picking up on this. I mean, is it possible to think of Al-Qaeda, to invoke your claim a bit, that there's this practice of foul play, and it must have a certain set of rules which America knows about and Al-Qaeda knows about, and that is it not, to understand Al-Qaeda, is it not wanting to enlarge that practice of foul play? It's a kind of negative view of it, but if you take this idea of practices having ethics and the participants having to be bound by those, I mean, it's a subaltern ethics, if you like. But is that not the? Would that not
I don't think that's possible. You know, you can't have a practice of foul play, because if you say that, you don't understand what a foul is. Because a practice of foul play would then have to be a practice with rules, which could be fouled. You see, it's like there's a game of cards called cheat, isn't there? Where the rule of the game is you've got to cheat all the time.
Isn't that what I'm saying?
Yeah, but can you have a practice in which the rule is to cheat? Can't argue about. You can't have a practice which says you've got to tell lies all the time, because it becomes internally incoherent. We're all telling lies all the time.
Can I add a small point? And there is some argument about also hierarchicalization of human lives. some lives being dispensable and some lives being indispensable. And what we see in the kind of discourse that you are referring to, through sanctions and all that, millions could be killed, but those lives are not as important as certain other lives.
Yeah, well, the practices I'm talking about are not committed to that hierarchical vision. The two, we only, I think there's a third global practice that I haven't talked about, which is the practice of science. But the other two, global civil society and the society of sovereign states, neither of them are committed to a hierarchical vision of human participants. Citizens are equal, rights holders are equal. That's at the heart of this thing. And it's the first time in history we've had such a practice, ever.
Okay, well, thank you for such a Sorry we've gone over time, but I didn't want to...
And I apologize for drawing you away from your market.